Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about the fact that on the big three, the range of motion is pretty ambiguous. Now people will say, well Jason, a deadlift is from the floor till you lock out at the top. Till I do a sumo like that off of a 2-inch block pull. Change the range of motion. And that was a very easy 600 pounds. Or is this full range of motion to where I come over and pull 615 conventional? Like, no one will argue about the legitimacy of this lift. No straps, nothing but a belt, shorts and socks on, good lockout, held it at the top, lowered it under control, no hitch. This would be a classic deadlift that every single strength sport in the world would accept. It's a legit lift, right? 615. But I train all these other things too. And we need to think about these lifts from that perspective. And it's one thing to say from a competitive perspective, yes, we need to have standards in place. If you want to compare your lift to another person, you need to have standards in place. Right? Same thing with a bench. This is, a semi-wide grip, well within meet legal grip. My pinkies are on the rings, so I could go several inches wider. I don't have a massive arch. I've got long arms. Even though this has got bands on it, so it's different. It's still 325 before the bands. Pause. Drive up. Everyone would say, okay, yeah, that's a correct bench press. That's fine. That's full range of motion. But, I'm going to have other clips come through here. I just grabbed a bunch of stuff and randomly threw it in for people to think about. Well, what about with the buffalo bar? I've now increased the range of motion. My hands now have to go deeper. And notice I can't do as much weight. This is a few pounds less of bar weight, a few pounds, quite a bit less band tension, 20 pounds less bands on there, by the way, 3 less pounds on the bar. And this is a little bit harder. Look, that's slightly grindier for me, especially because a couple inches have been added to the range of motion. Because we've just used a curved bar, my hands have to go further back. Well, what about someone who has a smaller rib cage? That might be a normal bench for them. Same thing with these box squats. I'm doing these off of an 11-inch box. Right, we're doing an 11-inch box here. But that's 3 inches below parallel. What do we consider to be a full squat? And now for powerlifting purposes, you just have to go below parallel. I'm 3 inches below there on that box. But the thing is, when we're programming box squats, we can program box heights to whatever we want. It's one thing when you're just squatting in the air and you go to whatever's comfortable or feels right or parallel. It's another thing with a box because you can set the box. Right? You can set the box to whatever height we want for training purposes. And we need to think in those terms. Why don't we train the exact range of motions we want for different strength curves and weak points? I would say that we should. Competitive standards should not affect your training for maximizing strength right here. Again, 2-inch deficit. This is way harder than that other deadlift I pulled. 2 inches further added. And I only got 575 there, so 40 pounds difference. But that's a 2-inch deficit. Same thing here. I've got a half board on my bench block stuck to this. Right? And that's a lot of band tension for those curious. That's a lot more band tension than I had on the 325. Takes 3/4 of the range of 3/4 of an inch of the range of motion off. And we could do different board heights to do different stuff. My point with this stuff is that range of motion on these lifts is in a lot of ways very, very ambiguous, particularly with the squat. Now, people will say, well, with the deadlift, it's not ambiguous. If you're using pads or blocks to pull from or to stand on, you're adding or reducing the range of motion from the normal range of motion. But not really, because the plates themselves are arbitrary. Meaning we decided like 80 years ago that this is what size a 45-pound plate's going to be in diameter. Right? We got a whole industry standard, and that standard was then used to calculate every lift from the floor, from the deadlift to the snatch to the clean and jerk. All these lifts and all these different strength sports are just calculated off that. But what would have happened if we decided those plates were 1 inch bigger or smaller in diameter as a standard? Okay? If we had made those plates an inch difference, particularly an inch in radius, either direction, our entire standard of range of motion on every pull from the floor, from a deadlift to a snatch, would be completely different. This was just arbitrarily decided. And again, I'm not saying that it's arbitrary from a strength perspective when you're comparing other people, but I want people to think in these terms too. When we talk about genetics for strength, what are we talking about? We're talking about limb lengths and ratios and structure. Okay, when we talk about genetics for strength, it's your muscle mass and your frame that determine your strength largely. The other stuff contributes less than 10%. All the other factors, such as your speed training and max work and everything else that we do, accounts for maybe 10% of our total max strength. Everything else is your bone structure and how much muscle you have on your frame. And that's been confirmed with studies at this point. This is understood. This is known. What do we mean by good genetics for a lift? How about benching guys who have really short arms and whose shoulders, because oftentimes the short arms can handle really wide grips, and guys who can arch pretty well, right? Well, their range of motion gets cut down. They're just more genetically gifted at the bench because they don't have to move the weight as far. How about guys with long arms in the deadlift? I have longer than average arms for my height by a small amount. That's why you guys watch on the bench. It's such a long range of motion. Deadlift is easier for me, particularly a sumo block pull. Look how easy that 600 was, that sumo block pull. Only time I've ever tried that lift. And it was so easy. And I stopped at 600. I thought I was going to hurt myself at that time because I wasn't pulling 600 conventional yet. So structure really makes these lifts different. And for you to get the same training effect someone else has who has a longer or shorter range of motion on these lifts from even doing their rep work, you would have to change the range of motion to theirs. But here's what I would suggest. For hypertrophy purposes and a lot of what we do, doesn't it make sense to add range of motion to some of these lifts? In other words, if we're trying to get the best stimulus to fatigue ratio, recruit the most muscle mass, and recover from it easier, wouldn't we want to increase the range of motion? Right? Wouldn't you want to consider that buffalo bar unless it puts stress on your shoulders? The same reason people use dumbbells, they can get deeper with them. Let me rephrase that. The reason smart people use dumbbells is they can get a deeper range of motion. I understand there are other reasons people think they use dumbbells. Some of it is not true. Not based on real programming. It's based on myth. But no reasonable coach or lifter argues about the range of motion. You know you can get a deeper stretch on your chest with the dumbbells because your chest gets in the way of the bar. What happens when you go to a bow bar? You get the same thing. Now, for deadlifts, if you wanted to practice holding a heavier weight, getting used to a heavier weight, and you don't have chains, couldn't you do block pulls like this so that you get used to lifting a weight that's heavier than your max? Yeah, absolutely. If you wanted to build the most muscle, again, we're forced to use a lighter weight so it's less axial loading. And we want to pull a longer range of motion so we get, again, a longer stretch shortening cycle on a lot of the muscles because the deadlift's a partial on every joint involved. Keep that in mind. Wouldn't we want to do some of those deficit pulls like I did? Wouldn't it behoove us to do so? Make it harder so that we have to activate more muscle to move even less weight? More muscle mass gets involved because we have to pull it further. We get a deeper joint angle on a couple of the joints involved. Means more muscle activation. Even though we're forced to use a slightly lighter weight on a deficit, we recover easier. So what I'm suggesting is that it's one thing to have standards in place for comparative strength, and we should, while keeping in mind that people's genetic structures will change their range of motion by several inches oftentimes, if not more, on any one of these lifts, still making them arbitrary. From a joint angle perspective and a work done perspective, it means they're just genetically gifted at these lifts. A short guy with a ton of muscle is going to be great at powerlifting pound for pound, right? It's understood because he's got to move everything a shorter distance. And if he's got the muscle to do it, if he's stacked, he's going to be good at it. He's going to be good at it. Because he's moving everything a shorter distance. And if he's got a lot of muscle, he can move a lot of weight a real short distance. But we should be thinking in terms of, for training purposes, that these ranges of motion are flexible from a training perspective. And it's something that we need to think about, something that we need to utilize for our advanced lifters. It's just a different way of looking at it, understanding that these ranges of motion are arbitrary and they are flexible from a training and a programming perspective. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.